Hey, good morning. Let's talk about death for a second. People around the world have different relationships with death. In America, some people fear it, others welcome it, while in New Orleans, Louisiana, they celebrate it. And like most things in America, it has its origins in enslavement. You see, New Orleans was the second largest slave port in what would become the United States of America, and so many Africans were brought to New Orleans that it was known as the northernmost Caribbean city. And with that influx of Africans, they brought with them their burial traditions. In many West African cultures, when a person dies, community leaders are notified first. Then the body is prepared for burial and is marched to the graveyard. And as the body is marched to the graveyard, it's followed closely by family, friends, community leaders, and community members who place coins and cowrie shells on the body. And once they get to the gravesite, someone says something powerful about the life of the person. And as the body is lowered into the ground, people mourn, women sing, and people make requests of the dead person's spirits. They ask them things like, watch over us, protect us, give us prosperity with our crops. And many kept those traditions with them after they were enslaved and trafficked to the New World. At this time, many white politicians passed laws preventing enslaved Africans from gathering in groups in the hopes of preventing an insurrection. They also passed laws dictating how many people could attend a black person's funeral. So after slavery ended as a way of life but continued as punishment for anyone convicted of a crime, newly freed Africans did what ancient Romans did and created burial clubs and social aid clubs, many for 25 cents a month. And those fees were used to help bury people who couldn't afford to bury themselves. And they also used that money to help widows in need. And in Louisiana, they passed Code Noirs, or black codes, which mandated every Sunday be a free day, and they forced enslaved Africans to practice European Christianity. And every Sunday in Congo Square, enslaved Africans would meet up and they would play drums, they would dance, sing, and play music. And through that, jazz was born. Around this time, brass bands were all the rage, and when a musician died in New Orleans, many members of the band would play at their funeral. Now, it's impossible to bury someone in New Orleans since the city sits below sea level. So city planners came up with a unique way of burying people above ground in tombs. And since it's so hot down here, many bodies would decompose in a year. So they would take a 10-foot pole at the end of the year, push the bones to the back of the tomb, and make room for another body. And sometimes the bodies wouldn't be fully decomposed, which is where we get the phrase, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. And sometimes people who were entombed weren't necessarily dead. So many tombs came attached with a bell. So if you happened to wake up in your tomb, you would ring the bell and someone in the graveyard would come let you out. It's where we get the term that's a dead ringer from. Now in Black New Orleans, when a person would die, mourners would walk from the dead person's house to the cemetery, and a band would play along the way. They would play songs like, pass me not, O gentle Savior, hear my humble cry, and while on others thou art calling, do not pass me by. And as the band would play somber music, behind the band, community members would come out and mourn as they traversed towards the graveyard. Now at this time, brass bands and ragtime were all the rage, and somber songs weren't so somber and sterile. In New Orleans, they put a little rag to it. So songs like I'll Fly Away went from some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away, to oh, some glad morning, oh, when this life is over, you know that I'll fly away. Oh, I'm going not to a home where joy shall never end. You know that I'll fly away. And after arriving at the gravesite, someone will give a powerful message about the life of the person. Afterwards, the body will be cut loose and placed in a tomb or lowered into the ground, where people will mourn, people will cry, and then the band will strike up a celebration song. Something like, oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, Lord, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. These songs of celebration were sung after the person was interred because they no longer had to deal with the evils of this world. They no longer had to deal with racism, hatred, bigotry, all because of the color of their skin. They had now gone on to a better place, and so we celebrate that. You don't have to deal with this anymore. I'm happy you're over there. Save me a seat. That is something to celebrate. And these songs of celebration would be played all the way back to the person's house for the repast. That's when people get together for food and drinks at a designated area after the funeral. Now, these songs will be played by the band who followed behind the body, family, and friends. They were known as the first line. And anybody following behind the band were known as the second line. And by the 1950s and 60s, these brass band funerals became known as jazz funerals. Now, jazz funerals have become a large part of Black New Orleans culture, as white people saw it as disrespectful at the time. So it's rare you'll see a jazz funeral for a white person. They're normally reserved for black people, specifically black men, musicians. But these funerals aren't just held for people. They've even held jazz funerals for Hurricane Katrina on the anniversary of her arrival. They also play a large role in tourism, as well as helping many New Orleanians heal from traumas. Now, these brass band or jazz funerals have lasted the test of time and strengthened the resolve of Black New Orleanians. And it's just one way that the people of New Orleans celebrate death.